Hey, welcome back to another episode of E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and Izba. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, for those that are joining us for the first time, you want to give a quick overview of what e-commerce on tap is?
Yeah, well, it's certainly the highlight of my week. But basically, what we do is we take a well-known, typically D2C company, we reverse engineer their supply chain, tell their founding story, and talk about their exit potential.
And we have a lot of fun doing it. And this season, we've kind of broken up e-commerce on tap into different seasons. This season, we're covering athleisure. So we've done like Gymshark, Roan. I mean, the Gymshark story was just phenomenal. I loved that episode. And today we're covering Adanola, which is based out of the UK. Really fascinating story. We're going to dive into everything that makes this a powerhouse brand in athleisure, as well as a failure story to begin with. But before we do so, was there any interesting tidbits that caught your eye this past week?
Well, obviously, there was a ton of movement on tariffs, particularly around China. Going from 145% to basically a 10% tariff. I know we had the 20% before, and so it's technically 30. That's been a huge thing. And so, as I was going through and just thinking through all of the different news articles and things that come out, I just became really struck by this idea that China and the U.S. don't really have good replacements for one another. And so, I'll just give you a couple of examples there. We know that historically China has purchased a lot of agricultural products from the U.S. And over the last 6 years, they've tried to shift that. They've moved away from U.S. soybeans, for example, to Brazilian soybeans. And so they're now trying to import like 73 million tons of soybeans for Brazil, which is great for Brazil. However, there's only really one port in Brazil that could handle that kind of volume, and it needs an enormous amount of investment just to meet the current demand. And so I think China's kicking in a couple $100 million to try to upgrade and retrofit that port, let alone any other growth or any other things that are going on. On the U.S. side, it's very clear the U.S. is dependent on China for basically anything electronic. Electronics were the first carve out that was provided with all these tariffs, and it just reflects how dependent we are. And you go even a little bit further, we start looking at rare earths, which are critical for EVs and defense industries. That's another area where the U.S. just has lots of ambitions, whether it be Ukraine, whether it be Greenland, Canada, of getting these source of supply, but there's really no good alternative. I remember speaking with somebody at Anduril, the defense startup, and basically, they were saying that one of the hardest parts of their supply chain is that they have to have a U.S. supply chain. And there's just stuff that we don't get out of the ground in the U.S. There's stuff that isn't produced in the U.S. And so, they have an even taller task than just building something that they can sell.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, that's a real constraint of you can only, produce anything that stems from U.S. soil and U.S. manufacturing. That's a tough undertaking. What caught my eye, I'm always keeping an eye on different exits in the e-commerce and CPG industry. And Touchland, which is a hand sanitizer company, sold to Church and Dwight for $880 million. So 700 million was up front. It was a $180 million earnout. The brand was doing about $130 million in sales and 55 million in EBITDA. So pretty nice multiple. And I think Izba has direct experience working with Touchland in the early days, right?
Yeah, we worked with them when we were a young company and they were a young company, and so very excited for Andrea and the rest of that team there. Also Church and Dwight is a great landing place. I think that's the second client that we've worked with that has exited to Church and Dwight, and I just hear great things about that team and kind of the transition when it comes from being a startup to part of a public company.
That's awesome. Super cool and just incredible exit. I mean, I thought the hand sanitizer bubble had passed, and I can only imagine because Touchland kind of started during COVID when manufacturing hand sanitizer was just so hard to do. And they've obviously figured it out and, gotten to some nice scale, which is just incredible to see. And yeah, hats off to their team. I can only imagine what managing their supply chain looked like during COVID.
Yeah, it was pretty messy. They had lots of early growth pains, and then just adding COVID growth pains as well that were really difficult. Touchland's a really interesting business. I encourage people to take a look at their website. They do so much more than just sanitizer, right? They're really kind of leaning into corporate engagements and sponsorships and things like that. And so, yeah, really cool company.
Well, diving into Adanola, it's pretty fascinating because it didn't start with a monster seed round. It's, really a story of kind of a quietly confident, growing athleisure brand that, turned 5 years of flatlining sales into a multi-million-dollar pound empire. And it's a story of growth, of perseverance, of a founder who transformed himself, especially as a second-time founder, which we both know is hard to do, coming back from a failure that we'll touch on. And it's really just this evolution of this brand that I think is growing at a strong clip, that has a very strong base, and that I think many people in the States don't quite know of yet, but I think will soon. And it's just a pretty amazing story. So why don't we start? I guess, what's kind of the founding story behind Adanola?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this is going to be one of those great case studies that people look back to in a couple years, where it's an extremely well-disciplined, profitable D2C brand that people have probably never heard of. But to kind of dive in, Adanola was started by two brothers, so Hyrum and Josh Cook, who are from Manchester, UK. And before we get into the Adanola story, we've got to talk about Zevin Media. And this was a photo booth startup that the brothers co-founded in 2013. And what they wanted to do was to take traditional photo booths, which were bulky, outdated, they lacked integration with modern platforms, and they wanted to do a better way. And so they recognized that there was this resurgence of photo booths in the US, and the brothers identified a gap in the UK market and said, hey, if we had something that was modern, sleek, socially connected, I think we could do pretty well here. And so their stated goal was to go out and try to transform the photo booth into a tool for brand engagement and social sharing.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a pretty decent business model, and their target market definitely tailored toward events, store launches. I mean, they kind of created this unique user experience, and they started with just a 5,000 pound loan from their sister, and the brothers built a prototype that caught the attention of Self Ridges, which led to a basically back to back 8 weekend long booking. And they eventually kind of grew from that and started working with brands like Adidas, Ferrari, and Diesel. And by 2015, they were doing about 1.5 pounds in revenue. And in January 2015, Josh and Hyam, they pitched Zevin on actually BBC's Dragon Den. I don't know if you've seen this, but it's kind of like the UK version of Shark Tank. It's actually pretty neat. I enjoy watching it sometimes. And they were seeking a 50,000 pound investment for a 7.5 equity stake. And it resulted in offers from Kelly Hoppin, Duncan Batatine, and Deborah Madine. And they ultimately accepted Madine's offer of 50,000 pounds for a 25% stake, which would get reduced to a 20% stake once the investment was repaid. So they had success on Dragon's Den, and it kind of became like a darling story in the UK at the time.
Yeah, you're right. And there's the kind of question our listeners may be having is like, okay, well, if everything was going well, why aren't we doing an episode about Zevin Media?
Yeah, and so despite early success and a ton of media attention, they faced real challenges in sustaining profitability. So in November 2016, the company actually entered voluntary liquidation due to insufficient turnover to break even. And so this was like very soon after they were on Dragon's Den, which I can only imagine how hard that was for these founders. I mean, you go from being the highlight reel on Dragon's Den to now, filing for liquidation, which is, basically bankruptcy in the UK. And they employed about 6 people. They operated from a 2,000 square foot warehouse outside of Manchester. And I mean, this was really these two brothers' first failure, right? I mean, and I think every entrepreneur has failures in their career and in life. And so I think it's an interesting discussion to kind of touch on how do you bounce back when you have a failure like this, right?
Yeah, it's a big thing. I had a investor tell me once several years ago that you don't when you fail in a startup, you typically don't fail down, you fail up. And so there's this interesting concept that any experience is good experience, and sometimes getting those scars of what not to do is the best thing for the founder, not worst thing for the investors, because they basically paid your tuition. And if you go through and have a track record of wasting people's money, you're not going to be trusted to work on something again. But this is really something. Again, these were young guys, and so it's something that I think allowed them to understand where they made decisions differently in the past so they could do it over again. but you have to like to bounce back after failure. You can't take it personally, even though it is intensely personal.
I agree. And I mean, what rings a bell for me is I think about Y Combinator, in the very early days, Sourcify went through Y Combinator, and you look at the YC track record, and 90% of those businesses are not around anymore. Probably 8% of them are, growing at a steady clip, they're making some money. And then maybe that 1 or 2% became a unicorn, right? And is worth, billions of dollars. And so, you just look at how many founders start YC and how many typically within just a year or 2 or 3 end up shutting down their business. And I've caught up with many of those founders and, really just talk about failure and what they learned. And I think there's so many different takeaways, but you understand fundamentally what went wrong and kind of pull those lessons to then launch your next company, right? I think if you look at every successful founder, most of the time they've had, at least one or even a few failures in their career. And I think that's really just part of growth and part of, being an entrepreneur is it's going to be part of your career, and you've got to learn and build from that. And that's really what these founders do, right? I mean, they, took some time to regress and understand, okay, what went wrong here? Were there flaws in the business model? Were there flaws in the team? Were there flaws in the operating margin? And then took a step back. And, that's kind of, I think, when the roots for what they did next, came to fruition.
Yeah, as you were talking with those founders, what sort of things did they learn from failure?
Yeah, I think there's kind of twofold. Number one, I mean, it could be the risk that they were taking, right? Was it a market risk? Was it an execution risk? Was it, a product risk? And so I think the biggest challenge is when you take a market risk and you build something without testing demand. You see a lot of founders build a solution that doesn't really have a problem, that's a hair on fire problem. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I see founders make, is they just build a product that doesn't actually solve someone's problem with a dire need. I think secondly, there could be margin challenges where, hey, if ZERP changes and interest rates are no longer zero, this business doesn't make as much sense, right? And so sometimes it's market conditions that cause the business to fall flat. And then last but not least is just team. I mean, the number one reason startups fail is because co-founder split ups and breakups and challenges with the cap table, right? And I think now, even more so than ever, you're seeing that because a lot of these companies raise significant amounts of capital to grow, and now they've kind of flatlined or are not kind of meeting those valuation expectations, and the liquidation preferences of their cap table make it very hard for a founder to continue to be motivated to work as hard and put in what's needed to find success. And a lot of times they have to pivot into different product lines, and to do that when you're already a substantially sized team is extremely challenging. And so there's so many different ways startups fail, right? But those are kind of the three that I've seen that are top of mind when I talk to different tech founders.
Yeah, that's really, really insightful stuff. As you were saying, I was reflecting back on kind of my own experiences going through failure, and I think one of the things that it teaches you is that success is not guaranteed. And so I remember, my first startup that I worked at was Hubble Contacts. And this was 2016, 2017. And it was, I think it was at the time, one of the fastest companies to go to $100 million valuation in just a couple of months. And it just seemed like it was inevitable, right? Like it was going to be there. And so I left Hubble. I was, looking at the farmer's dog. I knew that was going to be a bit of a rocket ship, but ended up going with another company. And at the time, I remember thinking like, well, the farmer's dog's probably a better business, but I kind of want this other experience over here. And so I'll just catch the next one. And I think that, just that mentality of like, well, of course you're going to start a company, and of course you're going to raise tens of millions of dollars. Of course it's going to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. That was something that, sounds silly when you're saying it out loud, but that was a real mentality to have. Was just, you see all the success happening in that area, in that ecosystem. And now understanding that, it is not a guarantee. You have to fight and claw and bend your will into making sure that something is important is super, a super valuable lesson I learned. I guess, Nathan, like the key question that comes to mind is, can you be a really good founder without experiencing some degree of failure?
I mean, when I invest and advise and talk to other investors and startups, people in general have more confidence when you're a second time founder. And I think even more confidence if you have like a chip on your shoulder from your last company, right? So if something went haywire that was, out of your control and you have a chip on your shoulder and something to prove, I think investors are going to be even more excited to back you. And so, I think in general, most investors prefer to invest in second time founders. I think on the flip side, there is something special about being new to starting a business and growing a startup and just kind of having that naive nature that enables you to think and not realize, how hard it's actually going to be, right? Because I think when you've been through it once, you realize, hey, this is probably going to be the hardest thing I've done in my career. And sometimes that jades you your second time around. And so it's an interesting balance, I think, between, second time founders and first time founders and what you learn and what your takeaways are. And, why did this fail, right? That's a key question. And what are your takeaways? So, I think everyone has their own viewpoints, but I think in general, failure is a good thing when it comes to, a founder's journey on their entrepreneurial career path, because, you have so many lessons that you're going to take from that failure and continue to grow from that.
I completely agree with you. As I think about some of the lessons I want my kids to learn, this is kind of weird, but I want my kids to learn how to fail from their dad. And what I mean by that is I don't want them to be failures, but I want them to learn how to fail. I think the difference here is if you are only playing it safe, you're always going to get straight A's. You're always going to be, number one or whatever you pursue. But that means that you're really underneath your potential for where you could be. I want my kids to be in a harder class and get a B or a C. I want my kids to try to get on varsity and get cut. I want my kids to start a business, make some mistakes, and then come back. And so I think that is such an important piece around becoming a real founder. I mean, look at the Adam Neumann story, right? He had several failed businesses before he started WeWork, which did pretty well for a while until that went bankrupt and he left. And now he's raised $300 million for his new business. And you would think that, the investors, some of these existing investors who had put money into WeWork came back to Adam and said, yeah, here, we'll invest you again. Not because he had a track record of success, but because he had hopefully learned from those mistakes and was able to give very pointed questions. He had this experience, this expertise that he had gone through. And yeah, it was very expensive for a lot of people to get through there, himself included. But now he's at a situation where at least people know that hopefully he won't make the same mistakes twice.
Totally, totally. And I think too, if you look at founders, a lot of times, family plays a role in your inspiration, right? And so, if you look at the story of Adanola, the founders were inspired by their grandparents who were seamstresses, making bridesmaids dresses. And they developed a early appreciation for clothing manufacturing, which I think is, very unique, right? It's very rare that, you get exposed to seamstresses that are making dresses and whatnot, growing up. And so I think this influence played a vital role in their decision to start Adanola. And the kind of insight and idea behind the brand, as they said in an interview in 2017, was they had fallen in love with the idea of making clothes positioned, from the evolution of a photo booth into these clothes, right? In a photo booth, obviously, you're, designing yourself and dressing to, hopefully impress in that photo. And I think they realize, this is a key part of someone's life, and what they wear on a daily basis obviously impacts how they feel. And so, you know, they said that in 2015 they were presented with a different opportunity to start another business. When they went on Dragon's Den, they were asked what they were going to do after Zevin Media, and because it was more of a cash cow business in long term, they told them they were going to go into activewear, right? So obviously that's where they landed, and they spent about 12 months developing an activewear brand, which from our past episodes on e-commerce on tap, that seems about right in terms of activewear development. And I guess, one question that I have for you, Aaron, as we've both been involved with different activewear brands is, what does that development cycle look like? Let's touch on that as if, a listener is thinking about starting an activewear brand here.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it really depends on how unique you want to be. If you want to go out and have a Me Too brand, it's very easy to reach out to, say, Sourcify and say, hey, I'd like to produce some leggings and some athletic pants and sweatshirts, things like that. And you can have something up and running in a couple of months. But typically what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to tweak it in some way. And so whether it's designing the tech packs, which would be the easiest thing to tweak, and just, the fit and the cut and those sorts of things, or you want to go deeper into the materials, or you want to do something that's unique, that can take more time as you start to figure those things out.
Yeah, it's a really, unique process. And I think people never realize, with clothing, you basically customize everything, and there's, kind of endless opportunity and possibilities there. What does Adanola mean, right? I even asked you before we started, how do you pronounce this correctly? Because Google's telling me one thing, social media says another. I do, the name is growing on me, I will say, but I was like, okay, is there some foreign language that this, means something in, or what's kind of the definition?
Yeah, it actually doesn't mean anything, which I think is the fun part. It doesn't have any sort of dictionary definition. It's not widely recognized in another language. But it's more of a brand identity. It was a choice that they made. And they wanted something that was inspirational, aspirational, minimal, something that felt like it could be there for a long time. And the name Adanola actually came from a blog that Hyrum had created and prior to turning this into a fashion label. So he'd been working on this for several years just as a blog, a way to, I guess, build a following. And then they decided that they were going to turn that into the actual business. And so it's kind of like his baby, because while Hyrum was working on Zevin Media and even before, he had been working on this blog on the side for about 6 years. And so, when they decided they wanted to get into athleisure, they didn't even consider this. It was kind of off to the side. They went through, did a bunch of research, looked at a bunch of merging names. It just didn't work. And then finally Hyrum said, well, I got this blog. Why don't we just use that? And that's kind of how it happened.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And you would think, okay, did Adanola take off quickly here? It did not, right? So the early days
Not at
were
all.
extremely challenging. Monthly sales were under 10,000 pounds. But despite these different hurdles, they remained, committed to refining the product and, creating leggings that offered both style and performance. And I think they were driven by this desire to create affordable, stylish, and functional activewear for women, which is kind of unique because they're both, men. But for whatever reason, they were inspired by that. I think probably just because they'd seen their grandparents as seamstresses and kind of just admired the craft of activewear. And so, Hiram didn't pay himself a salary for years. They went through a lot of challenges in the early days, and this kind of sounds like another failure, but why do you think Hiram decided to double down on this business versus walking away?
It's interesting. Like, let's just look at the details here, right? They start the idea in 2015 when they have another business that they just raised money on and is doing 1.5 million pounds a year, right? Those are the two options there. And then they decide that business isn't going to have a future, and so they walk away from that. They end up liquidating Zevin Media in November of 2016, and then Josh ends up leaving in 2017. And so for about 4 or 5 years, Hiram is here, not paying himself a salary, trying to work on this athleisure brand. And, is like, I would imagine if you were to look at this for 4 or 5 years and be like, hey, what are you doing here? I know that, I get kind of funny looks from my wife if it's like going to be a bad month or two. I couldn't imagine 4 or 5 years. And I think what was different here was that Hiram had changed his mindset, right? So the difference wasn't between necessarily the market with Zevin or Adanola, because they're both big markets. It was how they approached it. And so he was really he felt passionate about this. I think, like, that's not to be understated. He felt passionate about athleisure. He kind of willed this into existence. And so he decided to really focus on things that he could control. This meant no hype, right? Just execution. It was a very quiet, understated brand for a very long time. While he was working on product market fit, he didn't take on any investor money whatsoever. They had an extremely lean team. And so there's a lot of those pieces that are there. And so you think about this, and they were laying this foundation from 2015 to 2020 to really try to focus on the product quality, the customer fit, the margin clarity, and they avoided all of the normal trappings that you would see in a typical D2C brand. And normal trappings meaning team bloat, right? You just kind of add people because people want to manage other people. Investor pressures, too many SKUs. They were laser focused on a small subset of SKUs They obsessed over the leggings in particular. They wanted to look at the rise, the waistband, the fabric, the feel. And this kind of product obsession came not from a strategy deck for how they're going to do it, but from lived frustration, from feedback that he was hearing from his very limited consumers and people that were close to him.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible how obsessive they got over leggings. And I think it was like the rise, the waistband, the fabric, the feel. They really touched on each part of what made a legging fantastic and great to wear. I thought one unique point was during this time of just narrow focus, they did take on one very unique and also inspiring angel investor, Stephen Bartlett, who co-founded Social Chain and now is the pretty famous host of the Diary of a CEO podcast as an angel investor. So, they definitely were attracting some of the right people, but the main turning point really came in May 2020 during the COVID-19 lockdown when they launched their Ultimate leggings. These were priced at 40 pounds, and these leggings featured a light four-way stretch fabric, a higher waistline for extra support, and no front seam to prevent discomfort. So as I described the Ultimate legging, just how obsessed they were in leggings, because I don't even know what, higher waistline would do and, all of that. But the product resonated so much with consumers that were seeking a comfortable yet stylish activewear for home workouts. And so I think this really is a formula of product and timing and price point, just really, matching so well. And, you talk about the timing, right? So many people were working out at home during the lockdowns. Timing, obviously, that was such a key product, as I described, really resonated with these consumers. And the price point was, fairly affordable, right? You compare a 40-pound Ultimate leggings to Lululemon. That I think their leggings are, 60 or 80 or even 100
They're
plus.
over $100.
Over $100, right? So, this is just a much better price point. It seems much about better value. And so I kind of wondered, like, did COVID make Adanola or reveal it? Or, how did they kind of go about turning the corner with this brand?
That is a really, really smart question. You know, I don't have any inside information on this, but I would imagine, based on what we've learned about Hyrum, that if it was up to him, he would still be working on this product and saying it's not quite right. And so in some cases, they were waiting for COVID to come about so that it was the excuse, like, it's now or never. And so it was, they had probably had something they could have launched earlier, but this was the opportunity to lean in and to do something bigger. And these leggings really resonated with consumers, which goes to show how important their work on product was. People were looking for really stylish activewear for home workouts, but they also wanted this kind of clean girl aesthetic that was becoming popular on TikTok at the time. And they created this comfort first fashion that didn't scream athlete, and it felt stylish to be on Zoom calls or on grocery runs, and like that was really kind of the brand that they nailed, and they went on to it. When we look at kind of how they went through and turning the corner, they did some really interesting things from a marketing perspective to build a organic, community-driven approach to it. So like many other athleisure brands, they focused on influencer collaborations. So they focused not on big names because they couldn't afford them, but micro and nano influencers, people with less than 1,000 followers, less than 10,000 followers. And they really kind of went through this UGC moment. And that's really what gave the brand a piece of authenticity, where people said, hey, look at this great thing that I discovered. You've never heard of them, but this is why you should. And so that's kind of how they went through there. With that, they leaned heavily into Instagram and TikTok. They had a lot of curated lifestyle content, really honing in on that target demographic of 25 to 34-year-old females. And eventually they started to get celebrity endorsements. And so, Kendall Jenner was seen wearing Adanola. And that was, something that they were able to lean into on their advertising and things like that.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible rise. And I think so many brands benefited during the pandemic, but how did they build a enduring business here, right? And so in Adanola's case, they built slowly and profitable. From 2021 onward, they began refining their back end and supply chains to support sustainable growth. They hired deliberately. You mentioned kind of that team bloat that a lot of companies had during COVID that they really tried to avoid, and instead invested in systems before headcounts. And sales soared, right? I think not necessarily because of viral ads or celebrity influencers. It was more so kind of this word of mouth, Instagram micro creators, and TikTok try-ons that kind of made them who they became, right? And Adanola during this time wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, right? So unlike many brands that got their COVID kind of moment and flamed out, they didn't overextend and they scaled deliberately. So I thought this was just pretty incredible, right? I mean, between 2022 and 2023, their revenue surged by 311%. 311%, which is just incredible growth. So they reached 57 million pounds with operating profits doubling to 18.9 million pounds. So, I mean, imagine that going from a failed company to now running a athleisure brand that's doing 57 million pounds between 2022 and 2023. And their order volume increased 98%. Units sold were up 110% year over year. Their employee count did grow. So I don't want to, paint this picture of, hey, this was a, one person or two person company, just the brothers. They grew employee count from 53 to 76 people. And they also opened up a 13,000 square foot headquarters in Manchester's Noma district, which I think they did this to kind of signify, hey, we're here for the long run. We want to, build a home for our business that, can sustain ourselves over time. And I mean, just this kind of growth during COVID is pretty incredible. I mean, what comes to mind for you, Aaron, when you think about brands that had their COVID moment and that were able to sustain the growth, right? Because I think that was very hard to do and well executed here by the team.
Yeah, I mean, the risk that everybody runs into is they think that tomorrow is going to look exactly like it is today. And so that could either mean a good thing or a bad thing. And so in the height of COVID, I mean, just think about GoPuff as an example, raised hundreds of millions of dollars, I think over $1 billion actually, massive valuation, and then came, cratering down. And that was because they had assumed and they put into their models that, hey, we're growing at 30%, month over month. That's just going to continue forever. And if you compound 30% for the next 20 years, wow, this is a multi-trillion-dollar company. And so you start to build that sort of business and infrastructure around doing that. You end up not being as disciplined as you should be. And then you kind of flaming out. And like, I think that the key thing here is that in order to not overextend, you have to be okay with leaving some money on the table. You have to be okay with not pursuing good ideas so that you can pursue your best ideas. And that's a really, really difficult thing to do. And again, like you look at this time frame, 2022 to 2023, that's when most of these other D2C brands were starting to die. They were thriving. They were doubling and tripling. And I think the most impressive statistic to me is the $18.9 million pounds in profit that they went through. And again, think of this. Hyrum was not paying himself for several years. And then just a few years later, he's making $20 million a year in profit on this. It's just remarkable. And, I wish that every story that you could of someone who gutted it out ended up this way, but it doesn't. I think like luck and timing and he was working on the right things before COVID happened. All of that came into play, but that's the reason why we're talking about them today.
Yeah, and so if you look at the key inflection points here, 2015, the brand is founded, self-funded, flat sales for years. 2017, Josh, the co-founder, exits. Hyrum continues solo. 2020 is really kind of their moment, right? So that's when they launched the Ultimate Legging during the COVID lockdown. Sales soar. By 2023, they are doing 27.8 pounds in revenue and about 8.3 million in profit. 2024, they go to 57.1 million pounds in revenue and 18.9 in profit. And then, also that year they opened up their new HQ in Manchester. And with this growth, they did something, really mature as founders, kind of, I think, set them up for the next step of success, right?
Yeah, and I think sometimes people are allergic to success or money. I'm not saying that's the way Hyrum is, but he made the really bold decision in 2024 to hire a CEO, to hire himself a boss. And it was a very mature decision. They ended up hiring Niran Shana, who was the chief commercial officer at Gymshark, who had helped scale Gymshark from 5 million pounds to 500 million pounds. And the key thing here is that Hyrum didn't just cash out and walk away. He just stepped back, and he's still involved, focusing on product, brand, and community, doing those things that only a founder can while letting Niran, manage everything else. And so, the kind of the key question to me is how many founders actually hire their replacement at the right time. This wasn't Hyrum waiting for the business to be in trouble. or being forced out and saying, okay, we should hire an adult in the room. But this was, hey, things are going really, really well right now. I think we should have someone else, lead instead of me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think very rarely do founders have the foresight to hire their replacement at the right time. I think usually it comes from board pressures or, external pressures that are, a bit outside their control. But for Hiram to do this, I think shows his maturity as a founder and leader. And I respect it a lot. I mean, I think there's kind of this discussion to be had about people saying that, okay, a founder that takes you from 0 to 1 aren't usually the ones that take you from 1 to 100. And I think there is some truth to that, right? I think it's very rare that you have founders that can grow to, from 0 to 100 plus. It definitely has happened. If you look at the largest tech companies in the world, like, Meta, obviously Zuckerberg's been there since, day one and founded Facebook. But you also look at Box and their founder, Aaron, and they're still running that company with a multi-billion-dollar market cap. So, it definitely has happened. But I think in general, most long-standing operators will say the business is completely different going from 0 to 1 compared to 1 to 100. And I think in general, it's a mature and oftentimes smart decision to hand the helms over to someone that, has operated at that scale before and has that experience. And I think that's kind of a hard but key decision that proves out to be successful many times, right?
Yeah, and I think it's not that the founder can't lead the business, but I think the key thing here is that if the founder needs 10 years to grow and gain the experience to make those controlled mistakes in a way that they can then be the leader the business needs, that means that the fastest the business can grow is in those 10 years, right? But if you say, all right, my slope is different from someone else's slope, and if our business is going to go from 50 million pounds to 500 million pounds, we need to bring someone in who has a steeper slope from a learning curve than I do. I can learn from. I mean, look at the Gymshark episode that we did a few episodes ago, and this was an example of a founder that stepped away, had almost an apprenticeship with having a CEO run that business before stepping back in and saying, "Cool, I was able to observe things. I'm now more confident in my abilities as a founder, as a leader. I'm ready to take the helm again."
Yeah, it's impressive either way you look at it, and that's definitely a key point when it comes to a business's journey and their success. I want to go back real quick to kind of this 40-pound price point, which appeared to be a key, difference when they launched their ultimate leggings here, right? Because similar leggings were going for over 100 pounds, and I kind of wonder when I heard that, I was wondering, is their supply chain different? What enabled them to have a much more competitive price point compared to other companies in this space, right?
Yeah, this is a really interesting thing because it's not as if Hiram was sewing all of these fabrics themselves in his apartment. Their supply chain really looks a lot like other athleisure brands that we profiled. A majority of their products are coming from China, although they do bring in some products from Turkey and the EU. They really focus on small batch manufacturing to avoid overstocks. And really, what it comes down to is that their early leggings were priced affordably as a strategic decision to offer high quality activewear at accessible prices. In other words, they intentionally took a lower margin in order to grab market share. And this gamble was that eventually they would have sufficient scale, volumes, things like that to help them achieve healthier margins without having to inflate prices. And so it was just really interesting here that their big innovation here was, yes, in the actual cut of the product, but they said, hey, we're not going to take a 90% margin. We're going to take a 30% margin or a 40% margin, whatever it needs to be.
Yeah, and I think, overall this worked in the early days of the Ultimate Leggings launching. It's kind of a bit unclear if this has continued, right? Because on their website, a lot of their leggings now appear to be priced in line with other brands, at over 100 pounds. I mean, they do have some that's a bit lower, like they still offer that version of the Ultimate Leggings for as low as 59 pounds, but, they definitely have increased prices a bit. I think part of that is just, the market conditions have changed. There's a lot that's happening, on Meta with, their ads and how expensive they've gotten and tracking and all of that. That's changed the market a bit. But, I think overall they try to be a bit lower price point than their competitors. But at the end of the day, right, Adanola controls its future. They're profitable. They're growing. They're definitely quite a bit smaller than other brands that we've covered. But I think this is a brand that's kind of at the cusp of getting to that next level. And if you look at their trajectory compared to, Roan or Gymshark that, we've covered on previous episodes this season, it is kind of a similar, growth trajectory outside of their early years, right? But from 2020 to 2024, they definitely kind of have hit that growth curve and look to be trying to continue. So I wonder, what does their exit potential look like here?
Yeah, they've got lots of options. Going back to the pricing conversation for a moment, I think there's a couple of reasons why they took price. The first one is I think that it was a quality perception, right? You can get athleisure pants on Temu for $4. And even if they come from the same factory, you're going to think that the $4 Temu pants are of a inferior quality than the $100 pants out there, right? Because there's got to be a reason out there for why they're charging so much. And so I think part of this was to make sure that people thought of them as a approachable yet still premium brand, not in the same way that Rhone is super premium, but kind of on par with some of the other things that are there. And the second thing is I think they just could, right? If they're thinking about potentially selling or exiting, they need to show investors that they have a strong enough brand that gets them multiples that are worthwhile. If they are, a 10% margin business and there's a PE firm or an acquirer that's going through and saying, hey, we think we want to buy these companies, they look at, company A that has a 10% margin, a company B that has an 80% margin. Well, guess who they're going to be interested in first, right? So part of this, I think, is just moving and preparing for an eventual exit. I think that the key thing for them is that they are still basically bootstrapped. They do have some angel investors, but there's no institutional investors on the books, at least that we could find. And so this is really giving them the timetable that they want, right? In the Roan episode, we talked about how El Catterton would, had kind of had a timetable for when they wanted an exit, and that was different from what the founders wanted. They don't have that issue. It does look like Hyrum is exploring a bit of a minority stake sale, not out of necessity, but really to help fund international expansion and infrastructure upgrades. And I would imagine that based on what we know for, call it 60 million pounds of revenue, their valuation today is probably 200 to 300 million pounds. And they could be a good acquisition target for somebody like VF or Nike or LVMH that are looking for that culturally relevant Gen Z appeal for consumers.
Yeah, I mean, I think they check the box of kind of what an acquirer is looking for, right? You talk about strong brand equity, you talk about repeatable product success, high profitability, and a evolving leadership team and a founder that's willing to, step aside and be mature and bring in someone that has scaled the athleisure business before. And so, I think they have obviously the optionality to do what they want and the ability to kind of hold and grow or sell from a position of strength, which is always a great, position to be in. And so I think it's a luxury that few founders have, right? In terms of this, optionality is really at their discretion and they can decide what they want to do. I was thinking as you were talking in terms of my key takeaways from Adanola and what stood out to me in this episode. I think there's a few different stories here. I think number one, to me, the ultimate leggings really, put Adanola on the map, right? I think without that product, we might not be covering Adanola today, right? So I think kind of the focus on product is really what made the brand here. And I think too, the ability to move on from a failure and grow and kind of, then have that maturity to, step up and see this brand, hopefully reach its full potential is, incredible. And I think this brand is just the starting point, and we're going to probably have to do another episode, next year or the year after to really, catch up with their growth.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that this story is still in the early innings, and it's hard to say that about a company that's been around for 10 years. But I would say most of the first half of those 10 years, they weren't publicly launched. They were doing public betas, if you want to call it that. And the thing here to me that sticks out is just the durability of the business, the durability and the tenacity of the founder to keep things going. And it is so easy to quit on a good idea, and it is hard to stick with it. and it's hard to know which good ideas are worth sticking with and which ones are you know, you need to move on from. And so, you know, I think that personally, I don't know if I would have suffered for 5 years not paying myself a salary to get things going, but I'm excited for Hyrum and what they've done, and really looked forward to everything we were able to learn from this episode.
Yeah, this was a awesome episode of E-commerce on Tap. You've got to do one thing before you press pause or go on to, you know, the next moment of your day. You've got to leave a review of E-commerce on Tap, and you've got to share it with a friend. What friend do you think would love this story, be interested in our other episodes? Share it with a friend. Aaron and I really appreciate you tuning in to this episode of E-commerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and Izba. We look at every review, every comment, and we greatly appreciate you tuning in, and we will see you next time.